Closed doors, I'm a fool for you.
Hello guys, so welcome for this part 2 session of our exception handling in Java. So in today's class we will be discussing what are how to handle exceptions, how to use throw close and throwable classes. So let's begin. So handling exception. So passing on exception, so letting the method caller catch an exception. So passing an exception simply allows us to catch every time there is an exception that is being uh, or that is happening every time we're calling an exception or a method rather. So method declares that it can be thrown on exception a particular type. With the method body, it can perform action which may cause the type of exception to be thrown. So as you can see, we have here an example of passing off an exception. So passing off exception refers to letting the method caller catch the exception. So when a method declares that it can be thrown an exception of a particular type within the method body, it can perform actions which may cause the type of the exception to be thrown. So should the exception be thrown, it can be then passed to the exception to the method caller. Because of that, method has declared that it can throw a particular exception, the caller know that such an exception can occur, and it must be also to be able to catch an exception itself, or rather or further pass it to the caller. Okay, so for example, so this is the type of usually when we have an error that occurs, this is the type of errors that actually is being prompted to us on our on our screens. So that is actually a sign that an exception has been caught, and it is now been passed for the user to see the area where the exception has occurred. So as you can see here in the example, we have here a null pointer exception on the lines 47 and 19. Okay, so that is an example of how exceptions are being passed. So catching exception. Okay, so catching an exception refers to declaring that you can handle exceptions of a particular class from a particular block of code. So you specify the block of code and then provide handlers for various classes of exception. So take note, you have different types of exception. We have, for example, we have the null arithmetic and etc. Okay, so if an exception occurs, then execution transfer to the corresponding piece of handler code. So to handle the exception in Java, we can actually use the try and catch and finally block. When we say try and catch and finally block, these are functions that we can use to check if an error has occurred, and then how should we handle that. So later on I'll be showing you how to how to use the uh, try catch and finally block. Okay, so as you can see here, specify the block of code, then provide handlers. I'm gonna use try and catch again. So so when you actually you have here a try block. Okay, block of code you attempt to execute while acknowledging that the exception might occur. Okay, so this is now the try. Okay, so we have try, catch, and finally. So every time when we say try block, when we say block, we are referring to the line of codes that we have. So for example, as you can see here, you can see the open and close brace. So this where the place where we place our statement. So this is actually the block that we are referring to. So when we say try block, it only indicates the statements inside these two curly braces. Okay, so when do we use try? Okay, we use try to on a line of code that we are expecting to have an error. Okay, so most of the time we use try, or try is being used every time we're going to input something. Okay, so for example, we are trying to input an integer, but then the user inputted a variable or a string. So if we're going to place that code inside a try, every time an exception will be happening, it it will be able to catch, or not catch, but identify, or uh, yes, identify the error, and then later on be passed to the next step, which is catch. Okay, so take note, on try we were able to identify that there is an exception. So in catch, segments of code that can be handled an exception that might be thrown by the try block that precedes it. Okay, so if an exception has occurred on the try, it will now be thrown to the catch block. Okay, so now on the catch block, what do we intend or plan to do with that exception? So whatever you want to do with the exception, this is the area where we process it. So for example, here as you can see, we have our try and then followed by the catch. So as you can see on the comments, actions your program will do if an exception of a certain type occurs. Okay, so you also have to take note that you also on catch we have to write the exception type and its name. So usually what we write here, we just write exception followed by a name. For example, we usually use just the letter E. So it's just catch, open, exception, space E, and then close. Okay, so so now again, so with this, every time an exception has occurred inside the try block, it will now be thrown, or it will be processed by the catch block. Now, what happens if there are no errors or no exceptions that occurred on the try block? It will just simply pass through the catch block. It will not get inside. Okay, the only time it's like an if-else statement. Okay, so the only time it's going to get inside of the catch block is if there is an exception that occurred inside the try block. So without an exception, it will not get inside the catch block. Okay, it will immediately proceed with the finally block. Okay, so for example, we have here, so as you can see, this is a public class try catch demo 1. So as you can see, we have int num, denum, and result. So here we tried the result equals to num equals divided by dnum. Okay, so as you can see, we have for our catch, we have an arithmetic exception, and then this arithmetic exception is the type of exception, and the name of the exception is mistake. Okay, so every time there's going to be an error from the try block, which is result equals to num equal divided by dnum, it will be forwarded or thrown to the catch block. Okay, so what is the possible result that this could happen? Okay, so in Java, everything you divide by 0 is immediately an arithmetic exception. So for example, if we have 10 for our num and 0 for our dnum, that would result to an exception. Okay, so that is actually an arithmetic exception. So if that happens, it will now be thrown to catch, and then it will simply print out attempt to divide by 0. Okay, so also we have here a sample for demo number 2. So here, as you can see, we are using an array. So inside our int num, we have array 401 and then int ij, and then as you can see for our try, we have here num okay, we have num 0, which is 4, and num I. Okay, and then we have num2 is equals to numj and num0. Okay, so as you can see, what will happen here is we will be having two types of error. Okay, one is an arithmetic. For the first block, it's going to be an index out of bound exception, because we cannot divide by 0. And then next is an index out of bound exception, because the value for I and j were not set, so the program cannot identify where to point, or where array address to point. Okay, so we have lastly, we have the finally block. Okay, finally block is an action you must perform at the end of a try catch block. Okay, so with finally block, take note that finally block is always being processed, even if there is an exception, or there is no exception that has occurred on the try block. Finally is always going to be processed. Okay, so typically cleanup codes for the try statement. Okay, so what do you usually, for example here, to give you, so it when you say typically cleans up code, for example, so there are types of code that we use and that we have to close to avoid leakage of data. For example, if we're going to use a scanner, okay, every time we use a scanner, it is always needed to close the scanner after using it. So when you try to use a scanner, if you're going to close it, usually the closing to the code where you place to close the scanner is being placed in the finally block. Okay, so for example here, as you can see, we have finally actions to occur whether the catch block exemption is executed or not. So example here, so this is our example. Okay, so no matter what happens here, finally is always going to be terminated. So here is an example of the cache, or the program flow on how try, catch, and finally works. So as you can see, you have your try block, and then it will now find the block of where of the type of exception it belongs, and then it will now check one by one if the type of exception matches the type of exception that has occurred. So take note, we have, for example here, we have 3 types. Okay, so you can have it whatever type you want. Okay, and then after passing all the exceptions or choice, and then it will now proceed to the finally block, and then ends there. So next, you have the block nomination is mandatory. So for each try block, there can be one or more catch block, but at most only one final. Okay, so every time you're going to use try, you can have multiple catch blocks, but you should always have only one finally block. The catch block and finally block must always appear in conjunction with the try block and the above order. So if you cannot use a catch and a finally if you don't have a try. So a try is a mandatory for you to have a catch and finally block. So a try block must be followed by at least one catch block or finally block. So again, if you have a try, you should always have at least one catch and one finally. And each catch block defines exception handle. The header of the catch block takes exactly one argument, which is the exception it will handle, and the exceptions must be of the throwable class or one of its subclass. Okay, so this is where, as we discussed earlier, you're going to place the type of exception that has occurred. Okay, so now we'll be using discussing the using the throws clause. So throws is a list of type of exception that a method might throw. Okay, so it is necessary for all exceptions except those of type error or a runtime execution or any of their subclasses. Then, so for example, how do you, to use the throws? Use throws, we just use the keyword throws. Okay, so for example, you can see here we have the template. So we have the return type, method name, and then if ever we will have to use a parameter, and then followed by the throws and the exception list or the type of exception that that you're going to choose, and then followed by the open, close, and then the statement. Okay, so for example, here we have public void sample demos string demonstration file, and then followed by the throws and then IO exception. So the type of exception that we are looking for here is an IO exception. Okay, so as you can see, the throws is being used on our methods or being attached to our methods. So we also have public sample void throws IO exception array index out of bound exception. So you can also place more than one what do you call this one, exception list if you must. And then the throw statement requires a single argument, a throwable object. That's why, so throw and then the throwable object. A throwable object refers to the exception list or the type of exception that you want. So a throwable object is an instance of the throwable class or it's a subclass. So for example, here we have a simple program that computes for the insurance. Okay, so here we have public class rate calc, and then as you can see, we will on our calc insurance method, we will be requiring there is a parameter for birth which is in a string what do you call which is a string data type or is a string object, and then it's going to throw an exception. So take note, since it's going to throw an exception, whatever type of exception that is going to occur, it will catch or it will get. Okay, so as you can see, we have here final year 2000, age is 0, and then as you can see here, the reason why we parse, you take note, this is an integer that parse it. This will allow us to parse the value of or the data type of birth variable into an integer, since birth is going to be in a string type that we've set on our parameter. Okay, and then to get the age, we will divide the year minus the birth year. Okay, and then now we're going to get inside an if else statement. So as you can see, I'll be creating a new object of the exception inside the if. So if the age is less than 16, so I'll throw a new exception to it. Okay, and then it will say that the age is equal to whatever age is given, and then else it's going to compute for the whatever insurance there is. Okay, take note, when I say throw an exception, it's going to make an exception. Okay, so when I say throw new exception, when the age is less than 16, it will create an exception. Okay, it will be thrown to exception, and then it would stop or it will not stop, but it will show age is less than 16. Okay, so now here on our main method, what happens is we're going so actually we have here another throw, which is an IO exception. So this buffer reader stdin, this is actually the code that we use for file management in Java. This will allow us to get variables or data from files such as Notepad. Okay, so with this sample program, our input will be coming from a Notepad file. Okay, so that's it. So again, so buffer reader, and then string data, birth year, and then it will get the line. And then now on our try and catch, so now first it's going to check it is going to call the calc insurance date method, and then inside that is in data. As you can see here, in data is going to be whatever, or in data is going to be the birth year that is placed inside the file or the Notepad file that we will be using. So the data would be sent on the calc insurance method, and if an exception is going to occur, it will go to the catch block, and then whatever exception there is, it will print too young for insurance. Okay, so what if there is, if this is going to, if it's going to throw a new exception, age is equal to age, it will now be thrown to the catch block, which will print too young for insurance. So as you can see, what happens here is we created, or we throw an exception so that it can go inside the catch block, even though it really is not an exception. Okay, as you can all see, that's all there is for our lesson for today. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you on our next class. Thank you.